Apple and Google are at the center of the growing debate over mobile privacy, just how much the software in our phones knows about us, and what the companies that make that software should be doing with the information. That's why both companies will be testifying at a Senate subcommittee hearing on Capitol Hill today, a hearing that may help determine just how much of a business risk government concerns over privacy pose to Apple, Google, and others. For more, we welcome Brian Marshall of Gleacher Co. Brian has more than 13 years of experience as an analyst in telecom and media. He's also ranked as a Bloomberg Best. Brian, good morning to you from Las Vegas. Tell me, how much of a business risk might this pose to Apple and Google in the worst-case scenario?
Thanks, Eric. I think if you look at it, obviously these companies are pretty large, mature tech companies. So at the end of the day, I don't think there's going to be any jeopardy to their overall business model per se. I think the real risk is how this impacts their reputations with their consumer base. Clearly these allegations are pretty serious, and invasion of privacy is something that consumers are not going to take lightly.
Consumers might not take it lightly, but what do they do with that information, Brian? Do they then go and buy a non-Google Android or a non-Apple phone? Do they buy something from Sprint? Do they buy something from Microsoft?
Well, they may be forced to. I think that that may be kind of far out there and kind of stretched out. But at the end of the day, I think if your most important asset is your customer base, and if they have reason to defect and go elsewhere, there are alternatives out there. I mean, if you look at it, for example, in the smartphone land, the HTC Thunderbolt on Verizon, is clearly the fastest phone today on a 4G network. So, there are alternatives, but I do think that is, something that is probably unlikely to happen.
How about the mobile advertising market? One of my colleagues just a few minutes ago showed some figures that show the expected revenue in that business to rise industry-wide to something in excess of $4 billion over the next few years. Surely that's what Apple and Google are interested in. That's why you saw acquisitions like AdMob, is it not? And if that's the case, and Congress were to limit their access to some of this location tracking information, might they not be able to capture as much of that market?
Definitely. I think if people opt out of location monitoring or location tracking, the two companies are going to have less data to rely upon. So clearly, they both bought, a mobile advertising company. Google bought AdMob. Apple bought Quattro. So, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this technology. And if they don't have data to populate, location awareness, then those technologies are going to basically be less valuable to them over time.
Brian, at what point does this become a problem, call it, for either of these stocks?
Well, I think if we get into the hearings and, we start seeing that these hearings are, start going the wrong way for the companies pretty aggressively and quickly, then, we might see some impact to the market caps. Again, I think that's probably unlikely, but, it certainly presents a risk, and, privacy violation allegations are pretty serious.
Brian, mobile telephony and technology is clearly at the top of our agenda this morning because of the talks that we understand Microsoft is in to buy Skype. The deal will be valued in excess of $8 billion. How might this affect the companies that you cover, companies like Apple, companies like Dell, for example? You cover a number of major hardware companies. What impact would a deal like this have on the industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, clearly this is moving pretty quickly, so we'll have to see what happens. But if something were to go down between Microsoft and Skype, I think clearly that represents a potentially new competitor to Apple's FaceTime, for example, as well as to a lesser extent Cisco and what they offer from a video conferencing standpoint from the consumer market called Yumi. So, I think that's definitely something that needs to be monitored going forward. But I think that mobile telephony obviously trends of the future, and if Microsoft were to buy Skype, clearly it would give them much more resources and footprint out there.
But should anybody in that world, Brian, be afraid of Microsoft? Microsoft seems to have kind of bungled some of its its strategy in the internet. Obviously, it hasn't been able to make much of Windows, its Windows mobile platform, and really the only thing people know Microsoft for in the internet world is Internet Explorer, Bing, I guess most recently, and Hotmail. Do we really expect them to do that much with Skype?
Yeah, that's a good point. But at the end of the day, Microsoft does invest the most in terms of annual R&D out of any tech company out there, over $9 billion per year. Well in excess of the number 2 investor in technology, which is IBM, at around $6 billion. So, because they've had some stumbles in the past, definitely wouldn't discount their scale and ability.
All right, Brian, thanks so much for joining us here on the Inside Track. Brian Marshall of Gleacher Co on Apple, Google, and of course the news about Microsoft possibly buying Skype.